So this is a topic I've talked about a few times in a few different videos, but I finally wanted to just address it directly, which is the issues with mental health services in Ireland specifically. These are problems that affect many different countries in very similar ways to how they affect people in Ireland, but the Irish example is the one I'm most familiar with, so that's what I'm going to be talking about. Ireland's public health system has a serious problem when it comes to things that aren't an emergency. If you do have something which isn't hospital worthy, if you're sick, you have to go to what's called a GP or a general practitioner, and that is not free. Every visit to a general practitioner, because they're all private clinics, is about 55 up to €60. If you're a student, campuses will sometimes have a GP clinic and you can normally get in for €15-20, but at the same time, obviously all the students want to access that much cheaper option, so it can be really hard to get appointments. And there's no free state-funded psychological or psychiatric help available that doesn't start with the GP. You have to be referred by your GP. So you have to be able to afford a GP visit to receive any other kind of care. Like in the US and in a lot of Europe recently, there's been a big move to call for mental health reform. A big campaign here in Ireland was the Green Ribbon campaign, hashtag end the stigma. But ultimately, a lot of it seemed to revolve around talk to your friends, be more open with your co-workers, sort of be more aware, mindfulness, lots of mindfulness. Not to diss mindfulness as a, personal technique, but for a lot of people that just isn't enough. There was a definite problem where it was focused almost entirely on depression, which makes a certain amount of sense because it is one of the most common forms of mental illness. But what those don't take into account is there's a big difference between people who suffer depression for a limited period of time, especially in response to an event, depression as a result of bereavement or a result of trauma, and people who suffer from chronic depression, which is not event triggered, it's not environment triggered. And even putting that aside, depression is just one of many mental illnesses, and it's one of the ones that is maybe the easiest to talk about because so many people have experienced acute depression as opposed to chronic depression. It's easy to sympathize and empathize from a position of having experienced acute depression to understand what it must be like to experience chronic depression. It's much harder for people to conceptualize things like borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia because they can't understand what that thinking process must be like, what the internal experience of that is like. It's much harder to imagine, and representation in media is so negative, and so most people, for one thing, don't understand what schizophrenia is. Most commonly, when people talk about schizophrenia, they mean multiple personality disorder. Schizophrenia is a lot more common than people realize, for one thing. It's about 1 in every 100 people. And for people with more severe, to use that word, it's not really a hierarchy, and I think there's a tendency to try and put mental illness in a hierarchy or make it a spectrum, try and compare one to the other. I don't think that's super helpful. We tend not to do it with other illnesses. Actually, no, we do it with other illnesses sometimes as well, and that's also not helpful. Health is not a competition. That said, there are mental illnesses which require a lot more care than others. There are what's known as antidepressants, and modern antidepressants they're not relaxants like Valium, they're what's called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They allow your brain to more effectively hold on to the serotonin that it creates naturally. Though not every person with depression is going to require medication. There are some conditions that are incredibly difficult to manage without medication. These medications are prescription. You have to be seen by doctors and psychologists to be in order to receive them, and then you need to be able to afford them. There needs to be care and checkups to make sure you're taking your medication in the proper way, that there aren't any unforeseen side effects, because it can take a while to get dosages and the exactly right kind of medication for an individual person. There isn't just one size fits all. But in Ireland, it's so hard to just access that. And you can go to the new, very nice Health Services Executive website, hse.ie, and you'll find that it's pretty easy to navigate, and you can find the services clearly labelled, mental health, and then you get this list of existing services that makes you feel for a moment like, yes, my state cares about me. But then it's all just, go to your GP, who's not a psychologist, and you will probably not need more care after that. Most people don't, apparently. But that just translates to someone seeking help that you will just not be able to receive more care through this route. And there are these constant walls keeping you out of the health system as though it doesn't want you to be able to access help. And if you look at this map of available mental health resources, including charities, it shows you how much worse it gets outside of Dublin and the East Coast. Ultimately, what needs to happen is that we need to reform the whole health service. But in the meantime, there just needs to be some level of understanding that not only people who have medical cards or who can afford to try maybe multiple GP visits should be able to access state health care for their mental health. Like, we have a state health service, and it is required under the setting up of this republic, it is required to provide for the health needs of its citizens. And right now it's not. And that needs to be fixed.